Baroness Greengross has withdrawn, so I call Baroness Fox.
My Lords, whilst I welcome the early expiry of 12 temporary provisions, what is concerning is that these were the only regulations removed from the Coronavirus Act. Despite the government claiming that as part of the one-year review of the Act in March, that they'd combed the legislation to ensure what remained was necessary or proportionate, that there was robust justification for retaining all of the provisions, no details were divulged, no criteria published, no cost-benefit analysis made available, and it's worrying if this was it. When MPs voted to extend wide-ranging powers for another 6 months to the end of September, the then Health Secretary stressed that legislation had been a crucial part of the government's strategy. Indeed, legislation has almost become a substitute for strategy, and what the noble Baroness Hale described as a bewildering flurry brought in haste. But I note it's harder to remove than install provisions, and there seems no hurry to get rid of them. But Matt Hancock also said that while the Act was essential, quote, "We have always said we will only retain powers as long as they are necessary." So can I ask, are these powers that remain necessary now? With the new Secretary of State for Health, can the Minister explain if there's any reason why after the 19th of July any element of the Coronavirus Act will be retained? Will the new review date of 30th of September be brought forward? If not, why not? I think it's interesting when you look at these specific 12 provisions because it does tell of a mindset in drawing up the original legislation, one of a worst-case scenario deploying the precautionary principle and therefore making laws that would have perhaps been better suited to informal arrangements. Sections 8 and 9 on emergency volunteering were intended to come into force should the delivery of health services be at risk because of the pandemic. But it's noted that despite significant workforce pressure, the NHS never did face that crisis. But to note, I know many qualified former health workers who volunteered but were never called upon. They were demoralised and felt demobilised, and maybe it's worth looking to them again for the huge backlog in the NHS. But the point I'm making is that the voluntary instinct was not utilised enough. Or look at section 25 to 29 of the food supply. It was assumed that draconian powers would be needed to force those connected with the food supply to share information, when in reality the food industry collaborated and shared data voluntarily. The law assumed the worst, and perhaps politicians should have mobilised positive solidarity rather than using the law as a coercive tool. One reason I mentioned the change of personnel at the Department of Health earlier is because, despite the Noble Minister telling me last week that the different tone and messaging on regulations has been driven by data, it does feel more like a philosophical shift in an emphasis from coercion to trust. The former Health Secretary spoke about the laws with a certain inflexible zealotry, once infamously responding to the Derbyshire Police's over-the-top fining of 2 women merely for meeting for a walk and a coffee, with the quip, "Every time you flex the rules could be fatal." This does seem rather different to the new position, to quote Sajid Javid, "We owe it to the British people to restore their freedom as quickly as we possibly can." Well, hear to that. Indeed, the Secretary of State noted in an article this weekend not only the economic costs of continuing lockdown measures, but the health costs. A helpful antidote, I think, to those who seem sometimes oblivious to the non-COVID harms caused by the virus. And I accept the moving account by Lord Moynihan as to just those non-measurable harms that will last potentially far longer than the virus itself. But I would also want to note the damage of the last 16 months that's been wreaked on democracy, in which freedom has been treated as a privilege, not a right. We can't assume that democratic norms will simply spring back to the pre-March 2020 level once 19th of July happens. History tells us to be wary of the dangerous precedents set, and in terms of a lack of scrutiny and even the abuse of the legislative process that has had enormous negative consequences on every asset of our public and private lives, I think we need to avoid complacency. Following on from the comments of the Noble Lady Brinton on civil liberties, that's why it's the responsibility of everyone in this House and in the other place to use even such rubber-stamping exercises as this in this room, my lords, to demand that every emergency measure brought in since March is expired and deemed as unnecessary as those regulations we are discussing today. It's time to move on.